Panel discussion is CI/CD ops for multi-cloud leveraging K8s. Let me introduce the panel discussion first. So, as we have also seen, this Kubernetes has become a key part of software infrastructure for many organizations. While it makes scaling easier and provides uniform way of deploy applications, it comes with its own complexities. Setting up and managing CI/CD pipelines is one of the important steps to streamline developer productivity in these complex environments. With us today on panel, Vaidik Kapoor, Smith Shah, and Somandeep Mukherjee. Vaidik has just finished his talk on a journey of adopting Kubernetes at Blinkit. Smith is Director of Technical Evangelism at Hasura and has worked at Udan and Flipkart prior to that. Somandeep is co-founder and CTO of Dashtool, a creator-focused company that boasts artistic abilities and productivity using AI. Yeah, so the panel discussion today is organized roughly in 5 parts. One, introduce the topic, understanding CI/CD practice in general, and in the context of K8s and multi-cloud. 2, experiences of the panelists in this context. 3, we look at the trade-offs and pitfalls of this journey. 4, we look into advanced use cases like CI/CD in multi-region, multi-cloud scenarios. Then we go into Q&A from the audience. So that's a rough plan. So let's get started. So what is CI/CD and CI/CD ops in the K8s? I mean, what's that? So do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. One of the wins of, I'll start from what CI/CD is that we want to push code and very quickly make it part of the user adoption. And that journey from there with the testing and then delivery it to the user in whatever way, like a phased way or a A/B way or whatever way. That's what CI/CD is. Now coming to where, for Kubernetes, I think a couple of things that come into play that are good on Kubernetes and bad. The good part is that Kubernetes handles a lot of scaling aspects of things on its own, like rolling out things on its own, having a smooth rollout on its own. But it also brings in the fact that we have to make sure that there's a layer which doesn't come out of the box in Kubernetes, which handles that. What do you want to deploy? How do you want it to be deployed? Like, do you want it to have an X number of traffic on it, or do you want it to be 100% rollout, or do you want it to have be on a different cluster itself? All of that needs to be managed by us, and that's not something that Kubernetes does. That's where CI/CD ops and a layer comes into the picture. So yeah, that's probably what definition would entail.
Mike, do you want to add anything to that?
I think continuous integration and the topic itself is quite huge. Continuous integration, particularly the way I look at it is all that Soumyadeep said, but with the intention, I think, just to add a little bit color to that, is to make sure that we keep integrating our work in smaller batches frequently. I think that is one important aspect, because that ability to that practice of integrating your work into sort of like a branch or like a pipeline, for the lack of a better word, that gets into the hands of customers is one of the first steps to speeding up software delivery. And delivery is actually getting it into the hands of your customers, right? And well, you can just send whatever to your customers, but you don't want it to break. So that's where you start adding all the quality gates of all sorts. And that's what CI/CD ends up being about quite a lot. On K8s, I think the way that I look at it is one of the things that Kubernetes has done is sort of made infrastructure a part of your application. Knowingly or unknowingly, if you're using Kubernetes, but if you don't treat infrastructure as part of your application, slightly closer to your application now through declarative infrastructure management, I think that's one of the things that if you don't know, then you should be worried about. And CI/CD ops, okay, it actually allows you to not just test your applications, but also test the entire stack, at least that's running on Kubernetes along with it, right? I think that is an interesting aspect because it allows you to just validate a lot more things in the same pipeline, in the same process, not just the application, right? So that you have a higher degree of confidence of like what you have built and what you've tested will actually continue to work exactly the same way in production because you're testing fundamentally and principally everything possible. And Kubernetes really enables you in doing that. So that's what I'd say about CI/CD ops.
Thanks, Vivek. I want to ask even fundamentally question. Why do we need CI/CD? Smith, do you want to
Yeah,
go on that?
would love to. So let me answer this question by saying, by giving a very thorough example. Let's say you deploy something and the deployment takes 1 to 5 minutes. What would that world look like? You're able to do continuous integration. Only deltas are tested. They're tested very quick. You are not afraid to make changes, and in case something goes wrong, you can always correct it in a very way. So you don't have huge downtimes, and you don't wait for the perfect time to deploy. You don't wait for it. You're always making changes with the intention that they are going to go live. Now let's say instead of 1 to 5 minutes, we do the deployments. Every deployment takes 30 to 60 minutes. What is that worldview? Continuous integrations are not that easy. Context switch occurs whenever a developer is deploying. You start having only morning deploys, only non-active peak hours deployment. Any You need to do at least some bit of Q&A, because the 30 to 60-minute window means that you have to be very sure of what changes are going there. And in case there is a mistake, there is going to be a repercussion. It's going to, and it would also have changes in batches. And finally, let's say a deployment takes a day to do it. And so first of all, what's going to happen in that worldview? You have lots of big changes going live. You need a dedicated QA team to really go through all of that. Context switches are very important. Your deployments, because it's a day, it becomes a weekly deployment or a bi-weekly deployment. And your fear of making things live goes tremendously high. And let me just tell you from a cost perspective that 1 to 5 minutes, because very little context switch, very little automatic testing, you save a lot of cost on QA, uh, context switches from dev productivity, and you also have much better changes going there. And in the worst case, like a 1 day deployment, you would need a dedicated QA team testing everything. Your time to go live with new features, etc., also suffers significantly, and your devs would 1 day just be spending that entire day deploying. So that just tells you that you essentially have wasted at least one entire 8 hours of day just deploying. So that is the world. If you want to achieve that 1 to 5, there is no way to do it without CI/CD being involved, and CI/CD allows you to automatically test it, figure out a strategy. Could be a red, blue, green strategy or whatever, and allow you to keep deploying without fearing that if things go wrong, there is a way to recover. And I think that's a very big fundamental shift that people need to understand and think about CI/CD, which still to this day does not happen as much as we would like.
Sorry, yeah. That reminds me of a quote that people say, like, why do you need brakes on your car? Because you can go fast, right? So you can apply brakes, you can move anytime that you want. So I think this is, I heard this in the context of CI/CD long time back when I was speaking to someone with ThoughtWorks or something. Yeah. Yeah. Now let's look at the evolution of CI/CD over the years, right? I think, I remember like early 2000s, like CI/CD was, organizations started adopting CI/CD, but you had to do everything in house and all that. And then services like Travis CI kind of came up, and kind of things started changing quite a lot since the declarative options kind of came up. Can you kind of talk about some of these evolutions, like what you've seen, etc.? And we will start with Somadeep again.
Yeah, so I think the first, like long time back, like a lot of CI/CD was what I call, it's not continuous. It's a release management cycle, which is fairly strongly still followed, but would be a manual one day in a month which would come up where till then all QAs have to test everything that goes out, everything needs to be done, and everyone will push their code, and then a QA will happen, and then one day a person would say, okay, now we release. And then there is a release manager who's doing a lot of manual checks. That's the world we came from. And then, of course, then came some tools which first thing that came into the picture, I think, if I remember, is people started at least adding tests that are automated. Right? It started with a unit test, and now then the integration test, and the generation of black box tests, which allowed that a little more confidence into what is going to ship, so that you want to just reduce the anxiety of a developer, and then you want to put those tests into some pipeline, and that's when I think the Travis CIs and the Circle CIs and the Jenkins of the world started coming up. And but even then, they were still very, if I remember correctly, in the Jenkins world, we would still trigger the jobs manually. That okay, now is the time when I want to do these end checks, and it was still not as continuous as we would call it. Okay, every push goes to do that, and that's the history of it. And from there, I think today, as Smith put it, if everything is automated, everything happens in 5 minutes. The confidence and the feedback cycle that it gives a developer is so much better, and the iteration speed is so much better for a product, that you can just keep shipping better quality to your users. So this entire journey, and I probably missed steps in the middle, but it's just it has been. I mean, I've been, and I'm fairly young, and I've seen the pre-Jenkins era to today, and it just excites me that when will every company start looking at 5 minutes deploy time and continuous deploy time?
Smith, do you want to add anything to that?
I actually had a story. So when I was, first day of my internship, I really wanted to impress my employees. It was C42 engineering. I mean, many of you might not know, which eventually got acquired by Gojek. So I had built a, database management system, which was like a school attendance system. And to really impress them, I thought, let me run this. It was in PHP, long time back. And I wanted to host it somewhere. So I hosted it on Linode. And before going to them, I thought, okay, let me add some cool features, which was just sorting based on 2 parameters instead of one, which I thought was really cool at the time. I don't know. But the moment, so I did some deployment, which was without a CI/CD. I, copy SCP those PHP codes, do that, did this, and I ran it and just went there. And when I went to show them that, the code broke. I mean, because I must have made some mistake in the PHP code or whatever. It just threw some error I could not understand. And to me, that day I realized it was so hard because I had made so many changes. I made so many changes. I did not know which commit broke it. I did not know what broke it. And to fix that, I had no other way to, even take that up during the demo, because it was just so much lengthy, because I had to SCP, they might see my password, and it would take some time. So it was that hard. And that day, I think one of the mentors, he put me aside and said, you should have probably integrated some sort of a CI/CD. Though he also admitted, because this is way back in 2012, no, actually 2011, and CI/CD was not as cheap or easy to do as now. But today, if I was doing it, I would probably at least have done a GitHub Actions. So my deployments would have some sort of tracking. And if I had something like Kubernetes or something, I would have been able to restore it right then and there. So I could have at least presented my demo. And the greatest interesting part is that while it had nothing to do with my core product, what I wanted to demo, but I still failed to do that when I did not have the supporting tool. So it's like a supporting tool, but you'll definitely miss it when it's not there.
That's quite an interesting story. Let's move on to understand the landscape of current CI/CD tools and how open source is kind of making an impact. Vaidik, do you want to take that?
I think one of the good things that's happened in at least this CI/CD landscape is that for once, Jenkins is not the only thing that we have available as an option. I mean, it served its purpose with the industry for a long time, but I've used Jenkins for almost 10 years now, and things have, I mean, it has a very rich ecosystem, but as a tool, I think there's still a lot of plumbing that you have to do depending upon what you're trying to do. And I think in everything that we've discussed so far, one of the things that we see is, like Smith was also saying, is that uh, every time you have so many manual operations, there are higher chances to make mistakes. And when you make a mistake, reverting back becomes even harder. And I think one thing that's happened is that the ecosystem has progressed on that a lot more. So all around, and CI/CD included. Um, if you want to look at specific advancements, I think one of the great things that's happened is that there are specific open source projects now coming under this dedicated umbrella foundation called CD Foundation, which is also under another umbrella called CNCF, which is under another umbrella called Linux Foundation. But anyways, point being that there are just many more open source alternatives now for CI/CD. Um, I think Devtron happens to be one of the. I mean, it's not open source as in under CD Foundation, but Devtron and similarly other projects that are also there that provide CI/CD capabilities. Devtron specifically for Kubernetes, but there are other things, and Devtron does a lot more things like a pass. But you have the likes of Drone CI, which is one of the other open source products. And similarly, I can't remember the names, but you should check out the CD Foundation website, which lists out some really interesting things that help you take your continuous delivery practice to the next level, bringing in the learnings of and maturity of really large and advanced and mature organizations into these products, right? So there are a lot many options out there, really. And if I'm also not saying that you should use all of them, but I think just learning about them helps you put your vision at a place that, like, all right, this is possible, and we can move towards it so that we can have software development a more a safer process.
Thanks, Felix. Now we want to move on to the experience part. I want each one of you take 2 minutes, kind of explain what are the experience of setting up CI/CD on Kubernetes in complex scenarios, right? So we'll start with Samandeep again.
Sure. So we started with actually at Udan. We, like, when I joined, it was a Jenkins heavy setup, like, and a lot of pipelining had to be done on Jenkins, as he pointed out. And then we realized that, like, for a developer, one of the things we realized is, for a developer, like, there is a lot of friction as to, okay, now that I've pushed code, I need to go to a Jenkins UI to see how things are working, and then bring it back to the GitHub, and then that seemed like a lot of friction, and people were not exactly actually checking that what to do. So very quickly we realized this, and also Jenkins was not giving us the flexibility of allowing us to bring up builds in a very controlled fashion. Like, I want to bring it up on a spot instance, and then we were also looking at a very multi-cloud setup at that point of time. And that's what got us that first thing is, for a developer, we have to move to GitHub Actions. We need to give a developer a way that he or she can see, when I push code, I see it right there, that where is it and how is the pipeline looking and what pipelines are even running and how they perform. So that was a major. And another thing, actually, one of the wins that from there we got was that suddenly people started noticing the time of deployment. Like, it was not a nudge, it was not like something we were driving. It's just people started noticing that there were repositories that would take 30 to 35 minutes to deploy, and they started looking at 30 to 35 minutes is not acceptable, we need to reduce it. And automatically there was every team, and this was when we had, I think, around 250 engineers there. And right, and every team started picking up things like, okay, we need to take build time as a metric to improve over the next quarter. And it automatically happened. We didn't push centrally, because it was just visible and it was so much better. So once the build started happening and pushing, like Docker registry pushing started happening there, the next step was that we need to make deploy super quick. And one of the decisions at Udan we took was that we want our deploys to be also controlled through commit messages, which has its own pros and cons, but we did that. But again, what that gives a developer and a product engineer a visibility that, okay, what is the code that is in production right now? There is full visibility in your code. So, and then with that, we actually, from a setting up standpoint, we had chosen Devtron didn't exist at that point of time, and we wanted certain features like L4 canary for some of our applications. And those things, we actually built our own tooling, which is still probably maintained in Udan as a Udan build manager is what we called it, that would ensure post build the deployment step, the configuration of what it deploy what, and it would be driven by a config within the service YAML itself. For example, like just to give someone a sense, if someone has a drop wizard YAML, right? If someone comes from a Java Kotlin background, is a drop wizard YAML, the Kubernetes config would be part of that YAML itself, like what goes there, and that would drive what the deployment does. So this, and it was a repo, and that repo kept increasing as in the next 2 years, if I remember, like every week. So my first introduction to Udan CI/CD was that suddenly we realized that this simple deployment is not gonna do it. You have to improve this. And from there was actually was a decent 4-member CI/CD team that was set up that would look at all things CI/CD within Udan because of this decision. While in hindsight, I would say if something like Devtron existed, or in fact many other tools that I have seen now, we wouldn't have taken that call then. But this is, I think, 2018, if I remember correctly, when we had taken that call. So, and even then we had to add features, and we kept adding features. Like now we have to ship ML models. Now we have to ship more languages. We have to ship more configurations. And at some point, I personally said we are just becoming a Kubernetes operator, and that's what it is today. It is a Kubernetes operator at the end of the day. And yeah, that's the journey of where I had left. Last I had left was the repo itself had some 10 contributors and maintainers by the end of it, with is probably it's probably a copy of Devtron today. Whatever I read of Devtron today, it's probably that. So yeah, and probably it should be open sourced. But yeah, that's been the experience where we've reached.
Yeah, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I think Soumyadeep really covered most of the problems that we had to done, but I'll kind of highlight one thing that a lot of folks still don't think about it. So I used to look after the transportation, function and supply chain. And once we had a very core library that we wanted to update, and many times I've seen this happening, that code library was used by multiple services, and many times we would deploy some of those services when we update the jar, but some would not be there, and that will lead to bugs which are very hard to comprehend. So let's assume that the logic changes something, how the data has persisted. So now the services which have not updated use the old format. Obviously these things happen very rarely, but when they did, they write in that way, and the new services write in different format. But now let's say that whatever they persisted, when it gets read, right? If an old service reads the new format, it would break. If the new service reads the old format, it would break. And you run into issues like that because you have not deployed and updated all your dependents correctly. And when I say this, it's so obvious, but you won't believe that there are many places still there, including I think at Udan we did not do it till much later, where any services the entire chain is deployed, and that's something that sounds trivial, but if you do miss that out, it could lead to bugs which would be just very hard to debug unless you can go and kind of connect it back. And when the team is small, yes, now when I told you in hindsight, it's very obvious that this was the bug. But when you are in that thing and somebody says some error is coming sometimes, and this is the error, why the heck that error is coming in, it would be very hard to do it because you would have been shipping so many changes that it would not hit you that, okay, that change has not really propagated across the board and is actually running an old service. And this is why we are experiencing current bugs. That's been one of my very core experience around it. And in fact, it's not very hard to do, but it's one of those things. I think when you do it manually or when you do it, you might miss it, and when you miss it, it would take some time for you to realize that this has been the bug there. And just so, because I'm not just making this up, we actually had one downtime where we use Kotlin, where the Kotlin converts the bytecode, Kotlin's function signature into Java bytecode, right? And we had some default argument added, but the signatures differed. And in the service where we did not update this library, when it tried to call it, because the signature had a change, it would throw no method error. And it's an exception where, it's a JVM level exception. So we were encountering it, and due to some reason it was not getting logged, and it took us 5 hours of downtime to figure that out. So it was a huge downtime. I remember giving that RCA to very veteran business leaders, and it was kind of very embarrassing, like why that happened. So yeah, that is my takeaway there. So how, while it's something very obvious and something very easy to do, but it's still a manual step, and it could be forgotten, especially when you start scaling out as an org, and when more engineers come in and they keep using dependencies, and it just does not get refreshed. So I wanted to just tell that lesson.
But I guess that seems like a inevitable complexity that you have to deal with when you're building microservices and distributed systems, right? I mean, I don't think any amount of maturity in CI/CD is going to probably help in that, right?
So I would say the way you can fix it is that, and one of the reasons why I feel this happens, right? I think a lot of folks think CI/CD is an afterthought. In fact, again, coming back to Udan, when Samit said that 30-35 minutes deploy time was getting into people, getting into under the skin of people, but it did grow to 30-35 minutes. It was actually 10 minutes in the initial days. And the reason why it grew is because people were like, we have bigger problems to deal with. And that's why it happened. So I feel the CI/CD, you need to also be a much more. It has to be part of your checklist. If you're saying that, if I'm putting out my code and I'm going to check for all of this because its correctness is very important to me, I feel the CI/CD also needs a checklist which has to be checked at a certain interval. Like all my dependencies, when it's updated, is it getting all my services are getting updated or not? Are my deployments time fast? Have they increased significantly? And and I believe most people are okay with it till the problem becomes so large, when actually changing it or fixing it would take them multiple days, when it could have been just a few moments in the initial when the problem arose.
Got it. Yeah. What do you want to add any of your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, this is amazing, right? Like these are things that just like happen at all large organizations. So everybody is rebuilding the same shit over and over again, right? Yeah, I mean, until I also did know about, in fact, around the same time when Udan was building their CI/CD platform, we were building our CI/CD platform in very aspects, very very similar, right? And of course, with the flavor of Blinkit big into it, right? And like I guess all kinds of bad things baked into it to support the bad things of that we did. Um, and but yeah, I think again, all of these things are just being realized as part of part and parcel of being in a microservices environment, right? And a lot of it is getting solved. I think so. Very similar to Udan, I think, like Smith was saying, that we used to like provision 15, 20 microservices for like every single change to test everything end to end in a black boxes fashion, because like, all right, yeah, my tests for the microservices pass, but does the bloody app work, right? And like often tests were not comprehensive enough, and there's another whole reason for that, right? And you have to solve for it. But those are the kind of complex problems that uh, we have some answers to, but nothing conclusive. And it's fine to spend some time on it, but a lot of like really foundational problems are solved, right? I think my learning in all of this, at least at Blinkit, was that you should not be spending time on foundational problems, right? So yeah, I mean, like I said, Jenkins has done its job, but when we're using Jenkins with Kubernetes, there's just so much of glue and plumbing work that we had to do to make things work because just the tools at that time were not there. And then those things will fail, and then you'll fix them. And it looks like that it works, but then after some days it fails again. And then you have the build time increase problem. So now you start putting build time optimizations. You start doing things in parallel. You start caching things. It's like, it was like, and you then find yourself that this 5, 6 member team has become a company of its own just without any revenue, right? So avoid that, right? And then of course you will be left with these problems of like contracts breaking in subtle ways, and you will, because of these kinds of like 5 hour outages will be such, and you will be pushed to innovate. And it's fine to innovate, it's just not fine, I think, to do the same thing over and over again, that the industry has been just doing that for so many years, right? So yeah, I think that was my learning. I think that foundational work, especially in the Kubernetes ecosystem, I think the Kubernetes ecosystem has definitely brought some principles together on top of which things are being built. And I think that's great. Those standards, those principles are great. And I think you should try to stick to them as much as possible. And then innovate for things that don't exist. Right? And that's what most companies should be doing. And the companies that are mature are actually doing that.
I think we're running a bit short on time. I want all of you to be slightly take quick at the next set of questions. So move on to the trade-offs and pitfalls part. One thing that I want to understand is like what are the inefficiencies to watch for, and what are the pitfalls there? What I think, well, you mentioned some of them already when you mentioned this, but if any of you want to kind of add to that, like what are the typical inefficiencies that are there when you're setting up CI/CD, especially in the Kubernetes ecosystem? What are the kind of pitfalls that you should avoid completely? I think Vaidik just added some of those points, but if any of you want to add anything more, please take it.
I think one very obvious one that I would say is, you use something like Kubernetes secrets, or at least have some sort of managed secrets like 1Password and all. Kubernetes allows you to do this. It's really remarkable when I found out that you can do 1Password integration with Kubernetes. But many folks don't. They ended up passing plain text all your secrets, or setting up a environment variable and passing them as plain text, or even worse, like you have a config table in your database where all your passwords for all your databases is in plain text. So those are kind of like very terrible patterns, especially when you're growing. Just imagine, right, that somebody's leaving and that person has access to all passwords, etc. You have fired that person. Think about the risk that is being exposed to. So maybe before firing, you would want to revoke his VPN access or something, because those are kind of the things are there. So encrypting your passwords, keeping in secrets, and accessing via that, I think that's very underrated, but I feel a lot of folks miss that step completely.
Cool. Vaidik, you want to answer?
Yeah, I just want to add a quick one to what just Smith said. Right? Again, a valid concern, and again, a thing that most teams also know about this, but don't do anything about it because it's just like so much plumbing work to do. And there are thankfully options available. And I mean, for example, again, Devtron does a part of this, but there are tons of things that are there now to do, but we just miss that. I think one of the things is that almost all the best practices are now, I think about that we used to, at least in my career, I've thought about that we need to follow. There's most likely somebody is solving that like as a pre-built solution. Just like you said, right? Those are the operational things that you don't want to do over and over again, but a very, very valid concern that you must address.
Somebody, you were able to say something?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that I was discussing, that we built an L4 canary, and one of the reasons was that at that point of time we thought, and maybe it's hard to say it's right or wrong, but is that if you want an L7 canary, you automatically have to add a proxy there to it, or like something like an istio proxy that brings up resources for every pod that you bring up in Kubernetes. And one of the things we noticed during our journey of cost cut is that it adds up to the cost. And once something is happening at per pod level, like the removing that aspect is such a big win. And that's the and a lot of today's CI/CD tools like an Argo or a Flagger, if I remember, and everything works on an Istio proxy. That's something that like we learned that okay, this is gonna add. Whereas I'll also suggest what we had done to remove it, or figured what to remove it, and I think it's still going on, is that Cilium has come up with, which allows you to do this on at the eBPF level, which is at the network packet level on the user Linux space, where you don't need a proxy. And that saves, if I remember correctly, 20% approximate drop was the win that you would get by just doing this. And the problem, another thing is, I was surprised that most people are not doing this, because eBPF or Cilium is not as that popular library in as much, because it goes slightly deeper into the networking ecosystem. But it brings up tools and capabilities that are today gonna be so powerful. And I'll add to this, like even observability space, it brings up things in the observability space, the network level, which whose capabilities are still, we are still seeing as they come up, and a lot of folks are working on this. That's something that, like, just I want to put it out there, that this exists, and it opens up a field of innovation that very few people are looking at right now. And specifically when someone so heavily in canary is such a common use case, like having a proxy in front of every pod is such a common use case, that this changes the game for that a lot. Yeah.
Thanks, Sumit. Let's kind of look at the advanced use cases. Maybe we'll talk about CI/CD, especially like focus just on CI/CD part in the multi-region or multi-cloud scenarios. Anyone of you want to take that up? Like, what are the additional complexities that are that we need to handle if you're looking at CI/CD, especially in multi-region and multi-cloud scenarios?
Sure. So one of the things that I think becomes very hard, two scenarios just pop up in my mind, and I'll just talk about it and let the rest of the panel speak more. One is, let's say you're doing independent Kubernetes clusters across multi region deployment, and your deployment succeeds on a primary or your one region, but the other region it fails. What do? Do you roll it back? The complete thing? Do you go with that? Like, what are those steps? Like failure to recovery in cases something goes wrong in multi regions, that they need to be thought of. And I mean, yes, one very is that you roll back if any of the region fails, but in some cases maybe you might want to go and deploy. For example, while this happened only once in my entire tenure at Udan, but there was a Microsoft Azure's central data center was down for 8 to 10 hours, because I think the fan stopped working. So the heat raised so significantly, they had to shut down the entire data center for 8 to 10 hours. So in that scenario, you would want that the other region goes through, because those changes would be critical at that time. So that is something that becomes a added complexity. Like, what do you do? What are the failure scenarios, and how do you override them? That is one. Second, I think that is very important is configuration management, because now your configuration management is going to be different for a different cloud or different region. And how do you propagate that? How do you maintain consistency across it? Like, do you have one store which has the entire world view of it? Then you kind of run into how you can't do a synchronous replication. Now you need to do synchronous replication, but now you have this added latency that you deal with. Or you might say, oh, look, let each region deal with that configuration on its own, but then you don't have a centralized view of that. So those are, I think, real complexities. And the best part is, I think there is no one answer that you can go with. Depending on the scenario, you would want a different answer to do it. But I think by asking these questions, at least whatever choice you make, you have kind of articulated to yourself and made those sound choices after thinking through, instead of just leaving it default.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add to that?
So one of the things about multi-cloud that we keep hearing is that how do we define multi-cloud, right? So there are so many ways to, like, a lot of folks, of course, have a misnomer that multi-cloud means multi-region, but multi-region can mean different things. Like, do we have different Kubernetes clusters? Is it a different control plane in different places? Or is it a single control plane at one place and you can deploy the data plane in different regions? Or another level would be a multi-cloud can also mean that it is more than one clouds. Like you have one Kubernetes cluster in GCP, in AWS, and in Azure, and are you orchestrating them with a single data plane or control plane? Or there is another level where there is a single control plane somewhere, and the data plane is across multiple cloud providers, which is any of these three or any one. So I think, and each of these bring up their own complexities and has their own pros and cons. And I think it is supremely critical that we take into account why we are choosing what and what comes up with what kind of complexities. Like, for example, a lot of complexities which Vedic in his talk actually mentioned comes from, do we even have the depth to maintain a control plane yourself? Do we have the depth? Does the team have the depth? Can you hire for that, or can you solve for that internally? That's something that a lot of people underestimate. That very quickly it becomes like you can do a self-managed thing, and very quickly it becomes like, okay, did you need a depth that, like as you said, etcd will stop working, and then what do you do? Do we have the depth to solve that? So like, but in I will also flip this around and say, if you have the depth, if you have the depth, right, and if you can manage the depth and maintain the depth for years for your company, then the flexibilities that it can allow are very, very powerful. And I'll put one thought out there, that how we did this. So we had at Udan, we had a single control plane with a data plane across clouds and data centers. This is a fairly complex setup that we set up. But again, I'll come back. What it allowed us was adoption for 500 services within the company became far easier, because like we could control everything from one plane. We could abstract out so much things from the developer that when we need when the push came to shove, that we have to reduce the cost, and it wasn't like 20%, 30% cost. We have to reduce by 70% cost, or 80% cost. That's what the push came to shove. Then these decisions that we made early on gave us so much control that, okay, I can just force configurations on our services and get the metrics out to see how it is working. I can force canaries on services and then go to the service owners and say that, dude, you are over provision. What the heck are you doing? And that gave us a lot of control. And that's probably a different talk altogether on that. But like, that's something that came up, and these challenges need to be solved. And I think we need to be cognizant on what is it today and how do we want to see it in future.
Yeah, I guess I see the complexity of using Kubernetes in the multi-cloud scenarios, but is there anything specific that we need to worry about when you talk about CA/CD, especially in that? I think that's an important part to just focus on. Right, and I understand CA/CD and setting up Kubernetes at multi-region, multi-cloud is quite demanding. I kind of get that, but are there any additional complexities that we need to kind of keep in mind when we think about CA/CD?
I think I think it starts from like having that unified developer experience that probably requires maybe an approach to a unified control plane. Also, is what Samideep was talking about. I think becomes fairly important, because you cannot orchestrate. The CI part is still probably straightforward. The CD part is the more complex thing, and that also depends on how your application is architected. So a lot of it actually depends on that, right? Like, you're doing active passive, are you doing active sharded across regions? I don't know, what are you doing, right? Like, depends completely on your business, right? And that introduces a fair amount of complexity. I think things like Smith was earlier saying, like, you're doing active, you want to go forward and still deploy if one region is down, because maybe all the traffic has shifted. And now we are going outside of the CI/CD scope of things. But when you're that complex, I think there's nothing that is independent of each other, right? Like, there's just so many overlapping concerns. I think configuration management is also something that Smith said becomes important. Service discovery particularly becomes very, very important, right? Because again, in microservices, things can fail due to so many reasons, right? Even though you've built the abstractions with Kubernetes in your cloud native platform, and maybe, it doesn't matter if you're on GCP or AWS or on both, or in the two different regions of AWS or GCP, to the developer and to the pipeline, maybe it looks like that you are deploying that one single application. But internally, still, these applications need to be aware who do they need to talk to and where they are. So to really enable CI/CD across multi-regions and multi-cloud environments, um, you have to go down to these levels of like what is going to happen in different kinds of failure scenarios. I think we spoke about a couple of failure scenarios, but there's just so many more possible. Uh, and again, that's again another space where you might not have really good products, but because the problem just becomes so much more contextual to your business, and you need to innovate there, right? Um, some of these things again are solved by tools today, some products today, but there's a fair amount of things that you have to do depending upon the architecture of your application, right? So I think that's the thing to keep in mind. For most companies, although I think going multi-region is probably most likely a possibility, a closer reality than being multi-cloud. Right? Like multi-cloud for reliability is usually a myth, is what I feel. It adds a lot more complexity. But multi-region definitely is something that can add some reliability. At least you can be in active passive mode, have low cost, and still be able to operate when the infrastructure data center sort of goes down, right? And those are very realistic scenarios that I think a lot of people who have been in the business would have seen probably once or twice in a decade, right? So I think those are the things to build for, and those are the things that are very realistic for most people at some scale to think about, and the complexities that come with it.
Thanks, Vivek. I think we're almost, it's 5:30. I think there's one question, if you want to add. So can you share some real-time repo for Blueberry deployments using Kubernetes? I mean, maybe we can just answer this offline in the HasGeek page, I guess. So thanks a lot, all Vaidik, Smith, and Sumya, and all the people who have joined on Zoom and YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think, as we could hear from all of the panelists, CI/CD is a very important tool to have. It will improve visibility and empowers developers and improves the code quality and all of that. It's very essential to kind of have. So if you plan to move your infrastructure to Kubernetes, so it's really important to keep in mind how you're going to take care of CI/CD and pay attention to the complexities that comes along with that. Thank you so much. Have a nice day. Bye bye.
Thanks for having
Thank you.
us.
Bye.
Bye.